I'm going to talk a little bit about how Adichie uses word choice to develop her voice. And we're going to focus on selecting striking words and phrases from the word choice selection of the scoring guide, and how that helps to establish the tone, or how tone being how the author shows how she cares about the subject. I'm going to focus this video on the use of the word single story. I've done a search of it, and she uses the phrase single story 16 times in her talk. So if you just hit Command F and search single story, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 times. And I find it interesting that she chooses to use single story instead of this word stereotypes. In this quote, she says, "The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story, or the single story, become the only story." And so, really, what Adichie is talking about in her talk is stereotypes and how often people will believe one thing that is incomplete about a group of people or a single person or an idea. And here we want to kind of look at why does she use single story instead of stereotypes. And so I'm going to focus maybe here where she talks about where the single story of Africa comes from. And she says, "This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature." She talks about John Locke, who sailed in 1561 and wrote false reports about African people. But as she says, it is the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. So I'm going to focus a little bit right here on these two paragraphs and think about why she would use a single story instead of stereotypes. The first question I might ask is, who is her audience? And as a TED Talk speaker, her audience are largely people in the West, Europeans, Americans, and people who are involved in those kinds of things. And so it might be alienating for her to use stereotype instead of single story, because stereotypes has a much more negative connotation than single story does. Even though she is offering pretty scathing criticism of the Western view of Africa. And so I would argue that her use of single story, even though it shows that she's very passionate because she uses it so many times, 16 times in this talk. But her use of the single story instead of stereotype also shows that she's very aware of her audience, and instead of trying to alienate her audience and to make them feel bad, she's inviting them to identify with her and to think about and reflect on the danger of having a single story of places like Africa. Another word choice that I want to focus on here is her use of the word wonderful poet in this paragraph. Oh, it's not going to do what I want it to. There we go. And think for a minute, why would she use wonderful poet um, when she's talking about Rudyard Kipling, who labels Africans as half devil, half child? And so that's one thing that we will talk about as a group, what she is trying to do with her word choice there, and what does it do for her voice. Thanks.